Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming in today's session. We're going to be talking through how to do SQL migrations right. There's a lot of ways you can move data. There's also a lot of ways to move data and not be successful with it. So we're going to talk through a little bit about why and how those make impacts to business decisions, cost models, and everything else like that. Before we really get into it, a little bit about EPI USE, the company that I work for. We are an AWS partner, so we do cloud migrations, helping people leverage the cloud technology and some of those different components. We are an advanced tier partner with the Microsoft competency, migration competency, SAP, and a managed services provider program member. As part of EPI USE, our group is the AWS services. As you will probably see on our website, there's a lot more that EPI USE does. We are one of the 35 companies within the group elephant covering that is EPI USE. And as part of that, all groups within that coverage actually do a 1% pledge of net revenue to go towards our nonprofit ERP, which stands for Elephants, Rhino, and People. Before we get too far into our presentation today, I want to say thank you for all of our clients for working with us and some of the different things that the nonprofit has actually done. The different impacts of communities that have been set up, bicycles that have been delivered to some of these different villages. We wanted to thank you for working with us. And if you're considering working with us in the future, just know that that 1% is going towards some initiatives throughout the world. But enough about what EPI USE is doing. Let's talk into our today's topic. I'm Chris Townsend. I'm one of our senior AWS solution architects at EPI USE. I have been in the IT space for about 15 years, primarily focused on enterprise IT environments. Been AWS certified for the last 7 of those 7 years. 6 of them have been holding as solution architect professional, so I've gone through 3 iterations and versions of that professional test. I'm a well-architected partner, trained, as well as immersion day training, a AWS user group leader, as well as have a heavy background in Microsoft workloads. So when we're talking about Microsoft workloads, it's not just SQL Server and Windows as an operating system. My background comes from one of my favorite databases, Active Directory, which isn't truly a relational database, but if you ever try to replicate an Active Directory domain controller, and it doesn't work, when you bring it back up, there's a database error. So that is my favorite database that we have on the platform.
You might be alone in that.
Yeah.
So I'm Tom Staub. I'm an AWS partner solutions architect. That's how I work with Chris as one of our major partners. I've been working with SQL Server since, as I like to say, since the years began with a 1 instead of a 2. And been with AWS for about 7.5 years now, I guess. So great to be here. Thank you, everybody. I'm just going to get right into it.
Go down.
That's the wrong direction. So why should you be running SQL Server on AWS? There are a lot of reasons. We have a lot of customers, and every customer, every solution is different. But that's why it's so important that we have this breadth and depth within our services. Because you're not just migrating a database. There's a database, there's a web server, there's storage. There's so many other pieces that are involved, and it's important to have the right solution for all those pieces. And to have the right solution, it has to be reliable, it has to be secure. That's why we say at AWS, security is job 0. And it has to be performant. And it has to all be at the right cost. And all of these things come together. There are 1,000 different things that are important to different people, but these are all those underlying factors that are important to everybody. And we have more experience doing this than anyone else, and that's what helps us to drive those costs lower and deliver that performance. At the lowest level, it comes down to our Nitro system. So Nitro is a very special piece of hardware that has, like everything we do, has evolved over the years, but it enables us to move the monitoring, some of the storage, some of the security off of the host system. And this leaves more of that host system, a lot more of that host system, available to you for your workloads. At a much higher level, globally, we have 32 regions around the world, 102 of what we call availability zones, or AZs, that span those regions. And the way each one of these geographic regions is designed is each one has multiple availability zones. Each zone can have multiple data centers. But what makes the zone so important and so special is the way this is designed. Each availability zone is isolated from every other availability zone, but still has a very high-speed, low-latency connection between those availability zones inside the region, and then, of course, the regions themselves are connected to each other. So that's great. Nitro, the region design, that's all. But what does this mean for you running SQL Server? Well, what it means is you can run a high availability workload inside a region. Now, those availability zones I talked about, they're miles apart. And like I said, they're isolated from each other. But you can, even though they are that far apart, you can run this synchronous commit, automatic failover, high availability capability inside that region. And then if you want more of a manual failover, disaster recovery, yeah, you can run that in a second region. The customer journey to get there involves several steps. I never recommend to somebody just take whatever you have, stick it on AWS. It's automatically going to be better. There's no automatic to anything in this world. But doing it the right way, it is going to be better. And doing it the right way starts with an assessment. And you can't possibly hope to get the right end if you don't know where you came from. And so assessing the source is so important. And that's why I like working with EPI USE, because we've worked with them for years. They are, as Chris was saying, you know, they have the Microsoft competency, the migration competency, SAP competency, managed service provider. These are not programs that we just give out to everybody lightly. There's a process they went through to earn those designations. And a big part of what they do is this assessment process to not just migrate your data, but migrate it the right way. So I'm going to turn it back over to Chris, talk a little bit more about how EPI USE helps you do it the right way.
Thanks, Tom. So when we get into doing this migration the right way, we need to know what makes or breaks that migration. You can digest a lot of different, takes and opinions on that, but truly it comes down to is what is your migration process for a successful migration? It's usually a consistent pattern that's followed. Same thing goes for the cost. Cost can translate also to your time. If the longer you take to migrate, the more you're going to spend. So cost is a big factor, especially when you're starting to go from the technology side to the business conversations. If your business executives and your board is not on board with the cost to do a migration, that's pretty much dead in the water, and you're not going to be able to leverage that technology that you were hoping to have your access to. So it's all about that process first. So how does that process look like? You start out with doing that assessment, very similar to what you saw on Tom's slide. You need to do a portfolio understanding of what's there and understand the business dynamics and the drivers that are going to end up making your migration successful. As part of that, though, you need to go in and also do a portfolio discovery and then do a little bit of planning around that. And we'll dive into a little bit more of what that discovery needs to look like for this to be successful. But as you start moving on, you have your plan, you know what you have inside of your environment, you got all your skeletons out of the closet, you have identified every asset, so on. Then you start moving into your migration validation, application design changes, and then that's when you start really putting in that work to run proof of concepts, understanding those concepts that need to be there, get practice, validate that things are working, and then you start moving into a proper operating model, where now you're not just moving into it, now you're running sustainably in there, because you can move one application on Monday, but if that application's not happy on Friday, it's not sustainable. You need to go back through your process again. So when we're doing a discovery, what are some of the things that we're looking for, right? We need to locate the what and the where of where your applications and where all your different data and information is, right? So if you have data that is stored on SAN arrays that need to be moved up, we need to understand what are there and how that process is. You need to also look at your application and the data dependencies of those different pieces. Not every bit of data corresponds to the right application. And when you move it, latency is going to become a problem. So you want to make sure you define what data needs to move with what applications. You also need to make sure you target, as probably the most important, target those easy wins inside of your migration, right? When you're evaluating your applications and what's going on with those applications, you want to find your low-hanging fruit, another term that people use, the things that have just enough business drivers to gain that momentum, gain the trust of your business executives and your rest of your team, because morale can start dropping if you try to move the one workload for 30 weeks and it's just not successful. You want to find hey, this workload can be moved in 3 weeks or in 2 weeks, and start moving with those quickly. Get those quick wins under the belt as fast as possible. Some of those things that we going into that discovery, you need to understand your application, where your servers are, the networking requirements, and those storage. Those can be very daunting. It's a very challenging process to make sure you gather everything, because there's always going to be that one server in that random closet halfway across the United States that one office is using and for some reason wasn't picked up. So part of that discovery process that you need to go through is see where is what. Don't get stuck with the where is what, but find out what's there. You need to understand compute. You need to understand the storage required for that. Data compliances as well, because as you're translating or moving from your on-premise environment into the cloud, you want to make sure that your data is staying secure throughout that process, and that will define how you move those workloads. Your migration also has to be cost effective. If it's not cost effective, it doesn't align with business values, your migration is not going to end up happening. So one of the biggest things as you're working through this process is evaluate your business drivers and make sure that the business drivers are fully in alignment with your migration goals and capabilities. If the goal is to reduce licensing costs and you want to leverage AWS for that model, then you need to make sure that your migration plan includes that. That may be step 2 as part of that, but it needs to be there as part of your plan and presented to your executives when you're having those conversations. You need to make sure your workload is right-sized. You hear a lot at different cloud vendors such as Microsoft or at Amazon that you pay for what you use, and that's a true statement. But you also pay for what you provisioned. So going back to my favorite database, Active Directory, if you have a domain controller with 16 cores and 64 gigs of memory, and you're trying to move that into AWS, it's going to cost you an arm and a leg, when most domain controllers should really only be 2 and 8 gigs. So if we're looking at sizing those down, there's significant cost savings. On-premise, you'll have a lot of people over-provision their equipment, and so you have to figure out what is the actual right amount that's being used and leveraged for that cost model. You want to leverage any licensing you currently have, so it's going to make it significantly cheaper, going back to your cost drivers. You're also going to have a long-term cost-benefit models that need to be also included. So you need to be looking at, well, what is a 1-year, 3-year type commitment into those models? It's a lot of information that you have to balance, you have to adjust, you have to account for. But I do have some good news. We've gone through this process a lot, and it's one of those things that we're very comfortable having those conversations with you, with executives, going and having those type of presentations. One of the big things that we hear from our clients in questions is, how do we use these licenses? How do we build that TCO model and ensure that everything is actually right for the business cases? And after having a couple of those conversations with some of our clients, we ended up going through and creating a process called Windows Holistic Application and Licensing Assessment, or WHALE. It's a licensing evaluation and optimization to go and understand what applications you have, what's inside of your environment, leveraging assessment tools, getting everything right-sized, and then helping you create those business justifications for why moving to the cloud. So whether or not you're wanting to go and push the initiative for cloud, or if you have an executive coming down and telling you, hey, we're going to the cloud now you know that there's a way for you to be able to go collect all this information effectively and go and progress forward. So what is a WHALE assessment? A WHALE assessment can consist of a whole bunch of different things and different components, but basically, fundamentally, we're breaking it down to, we need to understand what type of hardware you have, what type of contracts you have and agreements. as well as the performance of your systems. Once we evaluate the hardware, scoping, virtual machines that you have on premise, we go through the process and say, okay, is there anything else in here? Understand licensing, so any EA agreements, licensing terms, software assurance, SQL Server licensing, the whole 9 yards. We digest that and then translate to, well, based on this, where's our happy medium of cost-optimized environments to performance that you need? Going back to that, make sure you have a truly efficient environment that it then translates to a cost model. Some key focus areas in this is, again, going back in through your licensing, making sure licensing is being understood, then it's evaluated. Licensing is a headache that everyone has to go through when they got to go do renewals. So go through, understand it, get it into the early process. Once we get the hardware rescoped and resized, then it goes into actual cost models. One of the bits and pieces that makes the most impact for this entire assessment is the impact it makes on an evaluation. So when you're doing a cloud cost model and you're looking at moving servers, taking CPU and memory and say, what is it going to cost on premise? What is it going to cost on Azure? What is it going to cost on AWS? Is trying to do an apples to apples comparison. When the reality is that your cloud is actually going to be more of an apples to oranges. You have to remember that things need to be optimized and you need to understand on how they're running. So going through that process, you can see significant savings by reducing core counts. So SQL Server Enterprise Edition is a very expensive core count license that you're having to pay for. If you can reduce your server or your cores from 8 to 4 because you're actually not using that full cores and you're not using the performance on that system, you can drastically reduce your bill. So I have a client that I was working with earlier this week and got to present to them this morning, a savings difference from that apples to apples to apples to oranges of 60% in savings on their AWS bill going into that cloud. So when you're evaluating those things, it becomes extremely important. While it's a little tedious up front and we can help with that process, it's critical when you're going to do those business presentations. So inside the Whale assessment, we go through and digest a lot of information, right? And some of the outputs you're going to get is different values and propositions. You're going to see that there's your online, your idle systems, or systems that are just draining on your environment. If they're just going to be sitting there draining on your environment, it doesn't make sense to move them, right? Pull them out of scope, move them up in a later time. Maybe it's a backup, let them age out into ever existence. On the flip side of that, we also need to do a whole bunch of information gathering on your licensing consumption. So Windows licensing and SQL licensing and how that all comes into play. So as you're evaluating those pieces, we need to see what's at end of life, what data compliances are going to require you to upgrade your system, and if it doesn't get upgraded, what is the plan for that workload? Does it need to stay in its own environment? And that's all part of those conversations and pieces. Because licensing can get very complex, it does mean that we have to do an in-depth on that licensing. So a lot of this information that's gathered and collected serves up secondary conversations with you to have those, how do we go in there and digest when, where, and how. We like to use Whale as that preliminary introduction to a migration. It's not a heavy, intensive process. It's going to be heavy on us, not on you and your team. So the whole point of this is to get in, get a good understanding of, is cloud going to cost $1 or is it going to cost $100,000 for us to do this? And then in that spectrum, then understand some of the basics and things that could be potentially limiting, so that way you know your decisions moving forward with your executive conversations. Whale translate into our migration process. And that migration process, as you see up on the screen, we leverage the AWS's process and methodology of the Migration Acceleration Program. That starts with your assessment phase. We go from Whale into an in-depth assessment, working with you and your team to understand your application and all the components that are there, as well as then moving into proof of concept. So building out landing zone, making sure security and compliance is all put in place, making sure that everyone checks their boxes, is super happy with what's going on. So that way you don't get halfway into your migration and then killed off by security saying, hey, this is no longer secure. We got to stop and halt the whole entire process. Once you've built out your landing zone, we've proved that the migrations are working, everything is successful, then you move over into your migrate and modernize phase. That migrate modernize phase is a rinse repeat process. You take your workloads that are there and then translate those workloads onto AWS. And with that, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you for coming in today. Let's chat at booth 411. And if you have any questions, feel free to let us know.